Hi guys, welcome to the second lecture of Introduction to Economics. So in the first lecture, we had made some introduction to the concepts, notions, and the methodology of economics. And now in this lecture, we will underline or emphasize the importance of the concept of scarcity once again. And then we will try to elaborate on this concept and make a relation between the scarcity or choices under scarcity and how it relates to economic questions that we will cover. So to have so this lecture will be composed of two parts. So in the first part, we will be talking about the choice under scarcity, and we will talk about a conceptual economy. We will start with one person, and we will try to understand the economic choices that a single person in a on an island have to make. So we will try to start with a very simple situation, and then we are going to extend this economy to include more than one person, and we will try to understand how the choice under scarcity might get interesting when more than one people interact with each other. Then we will make a relationship between these examples into more complex systems and what we refer to as economic systems. And then we will be talking about the role of government and market as an institution that somehow governs our economic decisions. In the second part, um, we will start talking about the market system in particular. We will try to understand the main driving forces behind economic decisions that are taken in the market economy. In order to do that, we will introduce the concept of demand and supply. And then in a market, so these demand and supply forces will compose a concept of equilibrium that will explain us how the price mechanism functions, at least in this hypothetical world that we are going to be talking about. So let us start with the first part. To remind you once again, the fundamental concern of economics was the choices that people take in the case of scarcity. So again, uh, we talk about different kind of situations under which people can face these kind of choices on when they have scarce resources to allocate on different alternatives. Uh, and these choices under scarcity, determine three key features that we are interested in economics. So the first question was what gets produced. So when it comes to a market economy, so this will be answered by uh, mainly by demand forces. How is it produced is another question. So it's another question that has to be answered in a world with scarce resources, so that this will be most related with the concept of supply. And who gets what is produced will be answered by the mechanisms or the design of how distribution and exchange takes place. So to understand these concepts better, so in order to be talking about consumption, for example, we should first understand the concept of production. So the first main economic action that has to be taken is mainly production. The production is a process of transforming some given sources, which are typically scarce by nature, into some so-called useful goods and services. So this usefulness might differ from person to person. So it is determined by whoever demands for it, so that we are not mainly interested why a certain good or services are useful, but we just rather assume that they are somehow useful and there's why there's a demand for it. But the main concern here is, so we have some scarce resources and we have some wants, no matter what the causes are. And so we have to process them in certain ways in order to produce these goods and services. So in order to do that, uh, we we call these resources that are in the scarcity as factors of production or inputs to production. So these are the things that are required for production. And we categorize these resources into three general categories. The first is capital, which is an abstract term that we use for things that are produced and then used in the production of other goods and services. So again, this capital is a very broad definition that it might take different forms. But mostly when we refer to capital, we talk about the things or physical things, or we refer to physical capital that might be tools that we need for production. So it can also be like infrastructure, like roads or bridges and so. Uh, all the things, all the tangible things that are required for production processes. So the capital might also refer to financial capital in certain cases. So these contain financial resources that might be made use of in certain production processes. Capital might also refer to what we call as human capital. So these might be skills or abilities, experience or knowledge that are acquired through education or other types of learning. So that in general, when we speak about capital, so it is something that can be accumulated so that we can invest in. And when people make such investments, they typically expect to have some returns out of it. So that these are the things that has to be first produced, repeat once again, and then they are used in the processes of production of different goods and services. So another factor of production is labor. Again, it's a broad definition, so that it might be any kind of labor power that is required or that is used in production. So it doesn't only refer to the muscle power that we might be using in production, but it also includes different types of skills or different types of tasks that are performed by labor. To illustrate, a manager is also considered as a labor because although we wouldn't expect a muscle power from a manager, it is still considered as a part of the labor force. And the third category that we're interested in is land. So this contains all the resources that are obtained from nature. So rivers or forests that we might make use of in different types of production is considered as land input. So the outcome of a production process is called output or product. So these are goods and services of value to households. Uh, so these are results of production processes. So to make use of these definitions that we have already made, let us consider a very simple example and let us make use of the famous story from Defoe. Uh, let us consider the world of Robinson Crusoe when he ends up on an island. And to make things even more simpler, probably Crusoe had a more complex set of decisions that he had to take. But let us consider a very simple situation that let us consider a situation in which Crusoe has only 10 hours and he can choose whether to go hunting, to hunt some deers, or to go fishing to catch some tuna fish. So let us assume that these are uh, only two alternatives that he can take. In this kind of situation, the first fundamental question that we were interested in is what to produce. So the cruiser first has to answer, should I catch fish or should I hunt deers? And the second question that he should be answering is how to produce them, right? So he has to decide, given that he has only 10 hours in our assumption, so he should decide, or he should think about how should he spend his time on hunting and fishing. So how should he allocate these scarce resources? In his case, is a time. Then he has to decide how to allocate his time over hunting or fishing. So let us have a look at this graph so we can um, investigate his decision graphically. So we assume that he has some given skills. So he has some so he has some skills that over hunting and catching tuna fish. So in particular, let us assume that in these 10 hours, he can catch a total of 10 deers if he had spent all his time only for hunting deers. Or he could also, if he didn't go hunting and he only spent his time going fishing, then he would end up with 5 tuna fish at the end of the day. So this is by assumption. So we just assume that as it is. We also assume that he can also take so that his productivity is the same. So in every hour, so in 1 hour, he can catch one deer. So that again, if he had spent all his time only for hunting, he would end up with 10 deers at the end of these 10 hours. Or so the same for tuna fish. So what we try to understand from this graph is what are the alternatives with this limited amount of time, which is the scarce resources that we are interested in this particular example. What are the alternatives that Crusoe could end up with? So this line, this black line here, shows if he spent all his time on either hunting or fishing, what are the combinations of deers and tuna that he would end up with? So again, as I explained in the beginning, so if he spent all these 10 hours only on hunting, he would get 10 deers. Or if he spent all his time on fishing, he would end up with 5 tuna fish. Or he might also prefer to allocate his time both on hunting, let's say half of his time approximately on hunting, and the other half on fishing, then he could end up with a point like C. Or he might also prefer to rest in between so that he can also choose any point below this line. But this point F is not possible for him because this is a point that he cannot manage given this scarce time resource. So to remind ourselves about the concept of opportunity cost, um, given that the time is scarce, if he wants to get more tuna fish, so the opportunity cost of getting more tuna fish is less deers, obviously. So that suppose that he compares these 2 points A and C, in order to go from point A to C, so he compares, for example, should I catch 10 deers by spending all of my time, or should I spend a bit more time on fishing, but what is the cost of it? What's the opportunity cost of it? If you also remember the definition of opportunity cost, which was the best alternative that we have to give up. So the best alternative is this point A if we're comparing these two alternative cases. But for now, just to remind you, we still don't know which of these points that Crusoe will take. In order to answer that, we should know how much he likes tuna and how much he likes deers, or how much he likes to rest, for example. In order to understand that, we had to know about the preferences of Crusoe. So far, we are just talking about the production technologies that he has given his skills. So, for Crusoe again, so the question is, what should I produce? And in order to answer that, he knows now, looking at this graph, he would know what are the production possibilities that he has. But still, in order to explain which of these points to take, so it could be any point on the line or below the line, but he would answer by looking at his preferences or what he wants, but it's constrained by the set that provides us with all the alternatives that is available to him within this given amount of time. But what happens if we introduce another person to this island, for example? So maybe you remember about the guy Friday. So now let's assume that Friday also enters to the picture. So that now there are two guys on the island. They choose the same thing. So whether to go fishing or whether to go hunting for deers. They still need to answer these two questions. So what to produce and how to produce them. So this how to produce is determined by their skills. So remember, in this graph, we have seen that um, in comparative terms, Crusoe can catch more deers than tuna fish, and given his skills, we know what are the possibilities that he has. But Friday might be a totally different guy. So maybe he is better in producing both. So maybe he knows the island better. So maybe in 10 hours, he might be catching 20 deers, and or he might be catching, I don't know, 10 tuna fish, for example. Or he might have different types of skills. Maybe he's better in only fishing, but he's worse as compared to Crusoe in catching deers. Or maybe he is worse than Crusoe in both hunting and fishing. So, what types of skills that he has, or what type of advantages when it comes to hunting and fishing, again, is determined by his capabilities. So, in order to understand the differences between the production possibilities between two different agents or two different people in this particular example, we have to understand two concepts. So, the first one is the comparative advantage. We say that a producer has a comparative advantage over another one in the production of a particular good or service if he can produce this particular product at a lower opportunity cost. So be aware that we are talking about comparative advantage. So we should be comparing one person or one firm or one company or one country to another in a production of particular product, and we compare them by looking at their opportunity cost in producing this particular product. So before comparing uh, Cruise and Friday, let us go back to the production possibilities of Crusoe to understand what his opportunity costs were. So again, in order to produce more tuna fish, he had to give up with some deers, right? And these amounts are known once we know about his production possibilities. So if if he starts from this point A, so if he's producing 10 deers and zero tuna fish, and he wants to increase the amount of tuna fish that he catches, let's say from 0 to 5, then the number of deers that he has to give up is 10. So since this line is linear. So we can also say that for each tuna fish, right? So he has to give up with 2 deers. So when it comes to comparing Crusoe and Friday in fishing, in terms of tuna fish, so the opportunity cost, since there are only two goods that we compare, the opportunity cost is measured in the number of deers that they have to forego in order to catch another fish. So for Crusoe, we know that for each tuna, he has to give up with 10 deers, right? So this concept of comparative advantages compares the number of uh, so it compares the number of deers. So when we are talking about comparative advantages in fishing, so we have to compare the number of deers that one has to give up in order to have another tuna fish. And the second concept is the concept of absolute advantage. We say that a producer has an absolute advantage over another one in the production of a particular good or service if he or she can produce this particular product using fewer resources. So it refers to a lower absolute cost per unit. So remember that. So the comparative advantage was about the number of when we are talking about fishing, for example. So the comparative advantage was referring to the opportunity cost, which is measured in the number of deers, but absolute advantage compares to people or to agents, so it can be countries or whatever, in terms of absolute cost of producing a certain good. So if you're talking about absolute advantage in fishing, and since the cost of production, so the only resource that is needed to produce one of these goods is time, then if we compare to people in fishing, we are looking at the time cost of producing a certain amount of fish, right? So for Crusoe, the cost of producing a fish is 2 hours, right? Because we know that he spends 10 hours in order to produce 5 fish. Um, so if I say that Crusoe has an absolute advantage in fishing as opposed to Friday, then I know that Friday has to spend more than 2 hours in fishing as compared to Crusoe. So these are the differences between the concepts of comparative advantages and the absolute advantage. So now let's look at what's happening in these two personalities. So again, so these are only examples. So by assumption, I draw these graphs. So for Crusoe, it's the same graph. So he can produce either 10 deers or 5 fish in 10 hours. Now let's look at Friday, what he has. So in the same amount of time, so in 10 hours, he can either hunt 5 deers or he can catch 10 tuna fish, right? So if we are talking about hunting, Crusoe has to spend 1 hour for each deer, and Friday has to spend 2 hours for each deer. So in that sense, we can say that Crusoe has an absolute advantage as opposed to Friday in hunting. For when it comes to fishing, so the opposite is true because Crusoe has to spend 2 hours. So this is the absolute measure of cost, production cost. But Friday can catch one tuna fish in an hour. So that Friday has an absolute advantage in fishing over Crusoe. So now let us compare the comparative advantages. Uh, so remember that Crusoe has to give up with 2 deers for one fish. So in fishing, the opportunity cost of one fish for Crusoe is 2 deers. For Friday, for 10 tuna fish, he has to give up with 5 deers. remember that since these are linear, so I can also uh, say the same for only for one fish, right? So if he has to give up with 5 years to catch 10 tuna fish, then it means that for one fish he has to give up with a half of a deer, right? So in that respect, for fishing, Friday has a comparative advantage over Crusoe because he has a lower opportunity cost in fishing. So these are the concepts of absolute advantages and comparative advantages. So why are these differences might be important when it comes to interaction between two people or more than one agent? It can be again countries, persons, or firms or such. So the idea comes from David Ricardo. He's a well-known political economist. So he conceptualizes the idea that if there are different comparative advantages, so we are talking about comparative advantages only, not about absolute advantages. So if suppose that there are two countries that one is better in terms of comparative advantages in producing, let's say, wheat, and the other has comparative advantage in producing apples, for example. So that Ricardo suggests that if there are such differences between different counterparts, then the trade is beneficial for both of them because they can specialize in producing the good that they have comparative advantage in, and at the end of the day, so via trade they can exchange these goods, and they will better off. So it is worth mentioning that again, so I want to remind you of the fact that Ricardo is talking about comparative advantages. So even a country is better in producing both of the goods. So suppose that a country, let's say country A, can produce more apples and more wheat at the same time as compared to a country B. But if they had different comparative advantages in production of these two different goods, the trade might be still beneficial to both of them. So our Cruise and Friday example. Um, so remember that one had absolute advantage in hunting and the other had absolute advantage in fishing, but they also had different comparative advantages. So Crusoe had comparative advantage in hunting deers, and Friday had comparative advantage in in fishing. So for some reason, again, we still don't know about their preferences, what they prefer, but just to have an idea about the benefits from free trade when they have different comparative advantages, let us assume that they both want to have the same amount of deer and the same amount of fish. So they just prefer to have the same amount for whatever reason. So with this given resources, Crusoe would end up with, so imagine that this is the 45-degree line, so that any point on this line is, one-to-one mapping. Um, so given his possibility, so the best alternative for Crusoe is this point C, where he has, let's say, 3 fish and 3 deers. And the same holds for Friday, so he ends up in the point F. So for now, I assume that they cannot exchange anything, right? So they only eat whatever they have at the end of these 10 hours. So for Friday, he also prefers to have the same amount so that he ends up with point F. Again, he has, let's say, 3 deers and 3 tuna. But what would happen if they could trade between each other? So what would be the best alternative, right? Um, so if they agree and if Crusoe goes only to hunting, so at the end of these 10 hours, he would get 10 deers. And Friday would go fishing and he would get 10 fish. And at the end of the day, they share whatever they have, so that Crusoe ends up with 5 deers and 5 tuna fish. So this point C prime now. And Friday will have the same, so he will have 5 deers and 5 tuna fish. So this comes from the comparative advantage, since they are better in producing different goods so that they can specialize. So this is the source of a better uh, so the source of the reason that they better off at the end of the day, because they do whatever they are good at, and they produce more of this, and via trade they both end up with a better result. So this is what Ricardo was after. Again, um, the free trade or the trade and specialization might be beneficial, even if one of them had absolute advantages in both of the economic activities. So it could still be the case. So you can try yourself that you can find examples of it, even if let's assume Friday was better both in fishing and hunting. They might still find specialization as a better alternative, and trade would be beneficial for each one of them. So maybe you can try that instead of 5 deers, suppose that Friday could catch, let's say, 12 deers, right? So then think about and also assume that both want to have the same amount of deers and fish. So if Friday could hunt 12 deers in 10 hours, they will still find it optimal or better that Crusoe will only go hunting and Friday will go fishing only. All right. So economics is not only about making such choices. So in this example, so they were trying to choose as if there were no tomorrow, right? So we just only gave them 10 hours so that they allocate the given amount of time and they consume what they had at the end of the day. But economics in general is not as simple, so that when we make such decisions, we don't only consider what we have today, but we also think about what we could have for tomorrow. So when it comes to that, the investment decisions become important, because when we have scarce resources, we don't only consider about what we can consume today, but we also consider potential costs and benefits for tomorrow. For example, if you are currently listening to this lecture, it means that you care about your tomorrow. So you're basically investing in your human capital in this case, instead of watching Netflix, for example. So that to differentiate between our spending on current consumption, so these type of goods that we use for present consumption, so they might be durable or they might be non-durable, so it doesn't matter. So these type of goods are considered as consumer goods. So whatever you buy from market, for example, although you save it for tomorrow, so you typically don't consider costs and benefits for tomorrow. Okay, maybe in certain cases you might also consider your cost for going to market tomorrow, but again, so I think you understand the concept. So the consumer goods refers to the goods that produced and consumed for present consumption. But capital goods are the things that we invest in, so that these are the goods that used for production of other goods. And so we make investments in order to produce capital goods. So these are the things that we are not going to um, immediately consume, but we will use them later in order to produce more goods that we are going to benefit from in the future. So in that respect, economic decisions are also affected by our expectations or perceptions about future costs and benefits. So, um, again, to understand the production possibilities, we use a lot the graphical representation. So we had already seen two examples of it for Cruise and Friday. But let us make a definition of it. The production possibility frontier is the graph that shows all the combinations of goods and services that can be produced if all of society's resources are used efficiently. So there are two important words here. One is all, and the other is efficient. So remember that in this definition, we are not talking about production possibilities in general, but we are talking about the frontier itself. So the frontier for Crusoe, or this black line that would show the number of deers or fish that he could have if he spent all his time, right? So he could also get 0 deers and fish if he didn't spend any time on hunting or fishing, but this won't be a point on the frontier itself. So to be on the frontier, first, we have to use all of our resources. So second, we have to use them efficiently. So we will be talking about what efficiency means. So it might mean different things depending on the matter that we are talking about. So again, the frontier, the production possibility frontier, or PPF in short, shows us what we could have in the best possible case from production perspective if we used all of our resources and if we use them efficiently. So if you use all your resources, but if you don't use them in a good way, so if you waste your resources, for example, then you're not on the frontier. So it doesn't mean that you spend them cleverly, right? So let us have a more general version of a production possibility frontier. So again, the frontier is the blue curve. So as you might have seen or might have recognized, that it doesn't look like what Cruise or Friday had. Now it's a concave curve that we have. So let's assume that this is a production possibility frontier for a country A. So again, from the definition, um, what does this frontier show us, right? So on the x-axis, we put the consumer goods, so the number of consumer goods, and on the y-axis, we have the number of capital goods. So the frontier itself shows all the combinations that country A could have if she used all the resources that's available to this country, and if she used them efficiently, right? So any point that falls below this frontier, so this blue line, is also possible, as you can remember from our discussion on Crusoe on Friday. But these are all inefficient points because if you compare, so this point E is said to be an inefficient production because we could easily increase the production of both capital goods and consumer goods by going point C to D. So we could increase our production without bearing any other costs, right? So if you are in a point E, so any point below this frontier is an inefficient point. So any point outside of this frontier is basically, as the name suggests, is an impossible point with our given resources. So we might grow, the economy might grow, so we might have more resources, or we might have better technologies, for example. Then we might reach to point F. But if we talk about production possibility frontier, then this point F at this time is basically a point that we cannot reach with these given resources and technology. So an efficient economy, so in terms of production efficiency, is the country that operates on these points on the blue line. So it could be point A, point D, point C, or point B. So again, without knowing about what people living in this country A prefer. So do they prefer more consumer goods or do they prefer more capital goods? So if we don't know them, we don't know which points on this line they would prefer. So they could either say, okay, we don't even want consumer goods, we just want capital goods to be produced in our country, so that point A might be optimal for them. Or so they might also say, we don't want any capital goods, but we only want consumer goods, so the point B might be also optimal. We don't know about it, but what we know is that the points on this blue line are all efficient, and so these are the points where there is full employment of resources. So again, to remember the concept of opportunity cost, in order to change our production from point B to C, so what do we do here? So we want to increase the production of our consumer goods from 400 to 500. What was the cost of doing it? The cost was the opportunity cost, which is measured in the decrease in this the production of the capital goods. So if we have already used all our resources, so that the economic choice has to consider. So the economic choice here is should we produce more consumer goods? So what is to produce, right? So this is the main question. Then we should know that there's a cost of it, which is the decrease in the amount of capital goods that we can produce within this country. So in order to measure this opportunity cost, we use the concept of marginal rate of transformation, which is basically the slope of the production possibility frontier. So as the name suggests, it measures the rate that we can transform one product to another. And so we denote the marginal rate of transformation in terms of y of x. So the marginal rate of transformation of x in terms of y is um, the change in y. So how much y should we increase or decrease, or most, let's say, decrease, if we want to increase the amount of good x by delta. So let us go back to our example. So what is the marginal rate of transformation between point D and C? So we want to increase the amount of consumer goods by 100. In return, we need to decrease the number of capital goods by, let's say, 180. So this is a negative change and this is a positive change. So the marginal rate of transformation is negative, which shows the fact that there's an opportunity cost attached to it. And again, so it's the slope, but between point D and C, we can think of it as the average slope or average change. So the marginal rate of transformation between point D and C will be delta y, which is a negative number, divided by delta x, which is a positive number. So it will be 1.8 minus 1.8 between these 2 points. So if you look at different resources, different books or different textbooks or different lecture notes, you might also see that marginal rate of transformation is defined by the number of outputs or the number of a good that we have to forego in order to produce another good. This definition is also correct intuitively, but however, when it comes to the mathematical expression for the marginal rate of transformation, it might be confusing because although it's a slope, um, so the interpretation of the slope might change, because if we define it as the number of things that you have to forego, then you implicitly assume that there's an increase. But it might also be the case that a country might consider going from point C to D. So then the definition of marginal rate of transformation following this definition would have changed. So in this lecture, when I say marginal rate of transformation, I am referring to the rate that how good I can transform my like a certain good. So if I'm talking about this relationship, so I have consumer goods on the x-axis and capital goods at the y-axis. So the marginal rate of transformation refers to the number of capital goods that I have to transform in order to have more or less number of consumer goods. So it is always a negative number since the opportunity cost is always the cost, right? So that if I have to increase consumer goods, then I have to decrease capital goods or other way around. So to repeat once again, the negative slope is due to the fact that so there are opportunity costs, and we also have. Oh, okay, so this was supposed to be a capital letter. We also have a. So there's a reason why we have a concave curve here. So instead of a linear line. So typically we have a concave curve, and the reason is, suppose that we start with a zero consumer good, okay? So we only produce capital goods. Or you can also consider that we start from a point A. So as I increase the number of consumer goods, remember that the frontier refers to full employment of resources and the efficient use of them. So when I start producing consumer goods, you can also think about another example. Let's say there are apples and there is, I don't know, let's say bread here. Doesn't matter what. But what we have generally is that when I start producing consumer goods, let it be our example for now, I use the most efficient factors, so the most efficient inputs in the production of consumer goods because I'm producing a few of them, right? As I produce more, the more I produce consumer goods, so the amount of capital goods that I have to forego, so the number that I have to decrease, is increasing. So this is referred to as the law of increasing opportunity cost, and it's basically due to the fact that the productivity of factors in production of a certain good is decreasing as we produce more of these goods. Uh, to make it more concrete or more understandable, maybe, let us consider that we have, I don't know, let's say avocados on this x-axis, and we have computers on this y-axis, right? So at point A, I have some farmers that's producing avocados, and there are some engineers, or most of my population is in production of computers for some reason, for whatever reason. So if I would like to increase my production of avocados, right? So the first people that I'm going to employ in this new production are the ones who would understand a bit about farming, right? So that I would get, I don't know, some low-level people who are working in computer production. That I will tell them, okay, you're not good at this. Just come to me and let's produce some more avocados, right? But the more I produce, so the less effective people or less productive people that I still have to hire, so that at the end, when I come closer to E or F, then I will also start calling some engineers to come help me to produce avocados, right? And obviously, the additional gain from these guys will be lower, which result in this concave shape of production possibility frontier, again, which refers to the fact that the more factor that I employ in production of a certain good, the less productive they become. So it again comes from the fact that on this frontier, I consider um, the best or the most efficient way of production. Again, the efficiency here is the production efficiency, and we still don't know, we still don't talk about of which of these points the country will be operating. We still don't know it, and it will be more clear when we start talking about consumer behavior and preferences. So again, under this frontier, we say that the so there might be two cases. Either the resources are not fully employed, so there's some kind of unemployment. So it could be unemployment in the labor market, it could be some capital, or I don't know. For example, there's some infrastructure that we are not making use of. So in that case, we are not on the frontier, but we are rather operating under the frontier. Um, So again, some there might be some other reasons for inefficiency. So it could be uh, wasteful use of resources. So you might employ all the labor, but we don't know whether they operate good or not. And mismanagement can also be a result for inefficiency. But this inefficiency can also come from um, a mismanagement of the economy, because economy is interlinked with each other. So for example, you can think of supply chain. So if one of the parts of the chain is not operating efficiently, then the other parts might also be affected from that. So that inefficiency might be caused from different reasons, but whatever the reason is, it means that if a country is below this frontier, so there is a room for improvement within this country. Yeah. Again, the efficiency as a whole. So when I say efficient, I might be referring to different things. So on the frontier, we have production efficiency, but the allocation efficiency is only sustained if we know what people want and if we are on the exact point. So to repeat again, so any of these points from A to F are, from production perspective, they are efficient. But if I choose country to operate point B, I don't know whether it is efficient from an allocation perspective or not, because I don't know what people really want, right? Maybe they prefer more consumer goods, so that maybe a point E is better than point D. So you have to make this difference when we talk about efficiency in general. So again, as I mentioned before, we can also see the effect of an economic growth by looking at the PPF. So the economic growth simply is a case where where a country or an economy or a firm or a person, whatever we are talking about, is able to produce more, um, either because they have more resources. Maybe this country A invested a lot in their technology so that they can produce more. Um, so that in the first case, so the production possibility frontier was here. Now in the new case, they can produce even more, so that this is a consequence of growth. So this is what we call as growth. So the growth might be of different resource or different reasons, so that it is not a necessarily a parallel shift that we have to observe. Maybe the technologies in production of consumer goods is better off, so that there is a better increase here. Or maybe there is not an increase in capital goods, but there's only increase in consumer goods. So there might be different types of growth as well. Okay. So remember that. So I will be repeating these questions a lot throughout this lecture. So we had the problem of what to produce and how to produce them. And one question to be answered is also who gets it. So we start with the one-person economy, so that Crusoe knew what the answer for the last question was. So who gets it? It was him alone. But even when we introduce the second person, Friday, so who gets it and what gets produced and how is it produced? start to be a bit complicated. So there are more dimensions that we have to know about. So the economic problem gets more and more complex. But how these questions are answered in even more complex economies, like real world. So how do different countries answer these questions? So there might be different ways to answer these questions. So there are so the way that these questions are answered, so the institutions that are involved in answering these questions determines the economic system that a country has. So there will be two extreme polars. So in the first, in a command economy, there is a central government or a central authority. So you can also think about a dictatorship or any type of. So there might be different types of governments that the central authority directly or indirectly sets output targets, incomes, prices, so that all these questions, all these three questions that we answered here in a command economy, is answered by the central authority. So this one polar, so that we had seen quite close examples of this. For example, Soviet Union could be an example of it, or China, maybe like third, or North Korea, you could think of, that all these questions are answered by a central authority. The other polar, which is mostly thought of a hypothetical world, if you like, is called laissez-faire economies. So, or we also refer to them as market economies or free market economies. So, this is an economy in which individual agents, so it could be people, it could be firms, or it could be some any type of free enterprise, that they pursue their own self-interest. So don't think about self-interest only as being selfish or something, but it could be any type of um, any type of wants uh, or preferences that people want to fulfill. So it doesn't have to be my own interest alone, but I might also like to, for example, make everybody else happy. So it could be also my self-interest. But in general sense, so in a free market, people pursue their own self-interest without any central direction or regulation. So that in a free market, so the only institution that matters for organizing or coordinating economic activities is the market forces. So, which is again driven by the self actions or the actions that are taken by individuals, which wants to fulfill their self interest, whatever form it takes. But in this free market, again, what is important is the price mechanism. So these questions that we arise before were answered without the help or intervention from a central government plan or directives, but these questions are answered by the economic activities. So what are these economic activities? So the production activities, consumption activities, or trade, so the exchange, are all coordinated by the changes, so by the direction of prices that take. So these changes in prices, which are caused by these economic actions, uh, will coordinate or will answer these economic problems that we have seen before. So, but in reality, again, so these two polars do not work at all. Okay, maybe in certain cases, but in real world, most of developed economies, at least, have a mixed system, so which involves both the market forces and the government interference. Uh, So in these type of economies, mostly governments have to take a role in order to regulate markets to a certain extent. But this extent might change from country to country, from culture to culture, or from society to society. So there is no agreement on. So the question in general is, what should be the role of government? So it is hard to argue that the government should uh, not intervene at all, but we recognize certain cases where government plays an important role in answering these questions for certain reasons. But the question is, what should be the extent of government intervention? And the answer to this might change again depending on the culture of the people or depending on the taste of a society. For example, in Central Europe or Western Europe, in the continental Europe in general, we have a more um, we have a large role is played by government, so that we have a concept of uh, social welfare um, economy, for example, where government regulates certain markets in order to have more equality in certain cases. But in the US, for example, where markets play a bigger role and government is limited with certain economic activities. So again, in reality, we have a mix of market economy and government intervention, but the extent might change or might differ from country to country. So this is the first part of this lecture. So we will continue in the second part of this lecture by talking about the basic force in the market. So in particular, we will be talking about what demand is, how it's formed, what does it mean, and then we will talk about the forces behind supply. So how firms firms behave when it comes to production and in their supply decisions. Just as a brief introduction, then the market, one of the most important concepts about markets is the concept of equilibrium, where these two forces meet each other. So see you in the next part.